The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Mira Castellanos stood in the sterile white chamber, her dignity stripped away along with her clothes, while military personnel prepared the radiation scanner. What they expected to find was contamination from a simple chemical spill. What the machine actually displayed made every person in that room freeze in terror. Classified BIO weapon, survivor clearance level, Omega Black. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete walkways of Granite Ridge Military Installation as Mira Castellanos approached the main gate. At 34, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen things most people couldn't imagine, but her current assignment was supposed to be different. After 12 years of classified operations, she'd requested a transfer to something normal environmental safety consulting for military bases. No more black ops. No more sleepless nights wondering if she'd make it home. Just regular work with regular people living regular lives. Her beat-up Toyota Camry looked modest among the military vehicles in the parking area, but Mira preferred it that way. Drawing attention had never been part of her skill set. She'd learned long ago that the most dangerous people were often the ones nobody noticed, and after everything she'd been through, anonymity felt like a luxury. The security checkpoint guard barely glanced at her civilian contractor badge as she passed through. Environmental Safety Consultant, the badge read in plain black letters. It was technically accurate, though it told only the smallest fraction of her story. What it didn't mention was her previous classification level, her specialized training in chemical and biological warfare countermeasures, or the fact that she was one of only 17 people in the world who had survived direct exposure to a weaponized pathogen that officially didn't exist. Dr. Vincent Kessler was waiting for her in the main administrative building, his pristine lab coat and nervous energy marking him as someone more comfortable with data than people. As the base's chief environmental officer, he'd requested the consultation after discovering some irregularities in their chemical storage protocols. "Miss Castellanos," he said, extending a hand that felt soft and uncalloused compared to her own. "Thank you for coming. I have to admit, I was expecting someone with more traditional credentials." Mira smiled politely, recognizing the diplomatic way of saying he'd expected a man. "I find that experience often matters more than credentials. Dr. Kessler, what exactly are we looking at?" As they walked through the facility, Kessler outlined the situation. Several storage units containing industrial cleaning chemicals had been showing inconsistent readings on routine safety scans. Nothing dangerous, he assured her quickly, just enough variation to warrant investigation. It was exactly the kind of mundane problem Mira had hoped to spend her days solving. What she hadn't expected was Colonel Rebecca Thornfield. The base commander appeared in the corridor like a storm front, her silver hair pulled back severely and her pale blue eyes taking in every detail of Mira's appearance with obvious disapproval. At 52, Thornfield had built her career on rigid adherence to protocol and an unwavering belief that civilian contractors were, at best, a necessary evil. "Dr. Kessler," Thornfield's voice carried the kind of authority that made junior officers straighten their spines. "I wasn't aware we were bringing in outside personnel for internal matters." "Colonel, this is Mira Castellanos, the environmental consultant I mentioned. She specializes in chemical safety protocols." Thornfield's gaze settled on Mira with the intensity of a targeting system. "Ms. Castellanos, and what exactly qualifies you to advise military personnel on safety procedures?" It was a challenge disguised as a question, the kind Mira had faced countless times in her previous career. She could have mentioned her advanced degrees in biochemistry and toxicology. She could have referenced her 12 years of military service, though that would require explaining why her records were largely classified. Instead, she chose the path of least resistance. I have extensive experience with industrial chemical handling and contamination protocols, Colonel, Dr. Kessler thought. My perspective might be helpful. I'm sure he did. Thornfield's tone suggested she found civilian perspectives inherently suspect. Just remember, Miss Castellanos, this is a military installation. We have procedures here that exist for good reasons. I trust you won't be recommending A&Y unconventional approaches. The emphasis on unconventional carried clear implications. Mira had heard similar warnings before, usually from commanders who viewed any suggestion not originating from their own staff as a challenge to their authority. She nodded professionally, though something in Thornfield's manner triggered old instincts she'd hoped to leave behind. As they continued the tour, Mira found herself naturally cataloging details that had nothing to do with environmental safety. The slight wear pattern on the corridor floors suggested regular movement of heavy equipment. The placement of security cameras indicated protocols designed for something more sensitive than routine military operations. Most telling was the subtle tension in the personnel they encountered, the kind of heightened awareness that came from working around genuinely dangerous materials. Dr. Kessler led her to the storage facility where the irregularities had been detected. The building looked standard from the outside, but as they approached the entrance, Mira noticed details that set off quiet alarms in her mind. The air filtration system was more sophisticated than needed for basic industrial chemicals. The containment protocols posted on the walls referenced procedures typically reserved for biohazardous materials. Most concerning was the faint chemical signature. She detected something familiar yet wrong, like a melody played in the wrong key. The readings have been inconsistent for about 3 weeks, Kessler explained as they entered the climate-controlled facility. Nothing dangerous, just variations in the baseline measurements. Mira examined the storage containers, her trained eye immediately identifying problems that Kessler had missed. The seals on several units showed microscopic stress patterns indicating repeated temperature fluctuations. The inventory logs didn't match the actual contents of some containers. Most troubling was the presence of what appeared to be cleaning chemicals that gave off a signature she recognized from a very different context. Dr. Kessler, she said carefully, what exactly is supposed to be in container designation Alpha 7? He consulted his tablet, frowning. Standard industrial degreaser. Why? Mira moved closer to the container, her senses heightened by years of training in detecting threats others couldn't see. The chemical signature was definitely wrong, not dangerous to most people, but unmistakably familiar to someone with her background. It smelled like a cleaning agent, but underneath was something else, something that made her skin prickle with recognition. Has anyone reported feeling unwell after working in this area? Headaches, nausea, unusual fatigue? A few maintenance workers mentioned feeling tired after long shifts, but that's normal for this kind of work. It wasn't normal, and Mira knew it. The symptoms suggested low-level exposure to something that shouldn't exist in a standard cleaning supply. Her mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. Either someone had accidentally contaminated the storage area with something far more dangerous than industrial chemicals, or the cleaning supplies weren't what they appeared to be. Dr. Kessler, I need to see the procurement records for these materials. Also, any personnel who've worked in this area over the past month should probably undergo basic health screening. Is there a problem? His voice carried the first hint of real concern. Before Mira could answer, Colonel Thornfield's voice cut through the conversation like a blade. She'd appeared in the doorway with 2 junior officers, her expression suggesting she'd been monitoring their discussion. Dr. Kessler, Ms. Castellanos, I need to speak with you both immediately. As they followed Thornfield back to the administrative building, Mira felt the familiar weight of secrets pressing down around her. She'd come here seeking simplicity, but the universe seemed determined to drag her back into the world of classified threats and deadly possibilities. The colonel's office was Spartanly functional, decorated only with military commendations and a few family photos that looked like they'd been positioned for public consumption rather than personal comfort. Thornfield closed the door with deliberate precision before turning to face them. "Miss Castellanos, I've just received some interesting information about your background. It seems your consulting firm has been somewhat selective in the details they provided about your qualifications." Mira kept her expression neutral, though her pulse quickened. Her cover identity was solid, but military intelligence had resources that could potentially dig deeper than most background checks. "I'm not sure what you mean, Colonel. Your previous employment history shows some significant gaps. 12 years of military service with records that are heavily redacted or classified above my clearance level. That's unusual for someone now working as a civilian environmental consultant." The trap was closing, but Mira had been in worse situations. "My military service is part of my background, but my current work focuses on civilian applications of safety protocols. I didn't think the details were relevant to this consultation." Thornfield's smile was cold and calculating. "On the contrary, Miss Castellanos, I think they're extremely relevant. Because if you're hiding something about your background, I need to know what kind of security risk you might pose to this installation." Dr. Kessler looked confused and increasingly uncomfortable. "Colonel, I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding. Miss Castellanos has excellent credentials for this type of work, does she?" Thornfield's attention remained fixed on Mira. "Or does she have the kind of background that might make her interested in things beyond routine environmental safety? The kind of background that might explain why she's asking questions about procurement records and suggesting health screenings for what amounts to a minor calibration issue." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a warning flare. Mira realized that her professional instincts had betrayed her. She'd approached the storage facility problem like the trained operator she used to be, rather than the civilian consultant she was supposed to be. Now Thornfield was questioning not just her credentials, but her motives. "Colonel, I was simply being thorough. Environmental safety requires attention to details that might seem minor, but could indicate larger problems." "Or," Thornfield countered, "you were looking for something specific. Something that a person with your apparently classified background might find particularly interesting." The standoff stretched between them, loaded with implications neither could voice directly. Mira knew that pushing back too hard would only confirm Thornfield's suspicions, but backing down completely would leave her unable to address what she'd detected in the storage facility. The chemical signature she'd recognized was real, and if her instincts were correct, people could be in danger. The decision was taken out of her hands by the sudden blaring of the base alarm system. 3 long blasts followed by a pattern that made Dr. Kessler's face go pale with recognition. "Chemical contamination alert," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the continuing alarms. "Something's happened in the storage facility." The emergency response team assembled in the main briefing room within minutes, their movements sharp and practiced despite the obvious tension crackling through the air. Mira found herself relegated to a corner chair, officially present as the environmental consultant, but clearly excluded from any meaningful participation. Colonel Thornfield commanded the room from the front, her authoritative presence brooking no challenge as she outlined the situation. At 13:47 hours, automatic sensors in storage building C detected elevated chemical vapor levels, Thornfield announced to the assembled personnel. Initial readings suggest a possible seal failure in one of the industrial chemical containers. We're implementing standard containment protocols until the situation is resolved. Lieutenant Derek Okafor, a young officer with nervous energy and eager eyes, raised his hand. "Ma'am, should we evacuate the surrounding buildings as a precaution?" "Unnecessary, Lieutenant. Our monitoring systems show contamination levels well within acceptable parameters. This appears to be a minor leak of cleaning solvents, nothing more." Mira shifted in her seat, every instinct screaming that Thornfield's assessment was dangerously wrong. The chemical signature she'd detected earlier hadn't matched any standard cleaning solvent, and the symptoms Dr. Kessler had dismissed as routine fatigue suggested something far more serious. But speaking up now would only confirm Thornfield's suspicions about her motives. Dr. Kessler consulted his tablet, his face creased with worry. "Colonel, the readings I'm seeing don't quite match our baseline profiles for the stored materials. Perhaps we should consider bringing in additional expertise too, Dr. Kessler." Thornfield's voice cut through his suggestion like a scalpel. "We have established protocols for exactly this type of incident. I see no need to complicate matters with outside interference." Her gaze flicked meaningfully toward Mira, especially from individuals whose credentials remain questionable. The room fell silent except for the continued hum of ventilation systems working overtime to manage the contamination. Mira watched the faces around her, recognizing the familiar dynamic of authority squelching legitimate concerns. She'd seen it countless times in her previous career, commanders so invested in maintaining control that they refused to acknowledge expertise that didn't originate from their own chain of command. Sergeant Tyler Brennan, a weathered non-com with 20 years of experience written in the lines around his eyes, cleared his throat diplomatically. "Ma'am, I've got personnel asking questions about the containment procedures. Some of the maintenance crew are worried about long-term exposure risks." "Then remind them that worry is not their job," Thornfield snapped. "Their job is to follow orders and trust that their leadership has the situation under control." But Mira could see that Brennan wasn't convinced. His eyes kept drifting toward the readouts on Kessler's tablet, and his expression suggested someone who'd learned to trust his instincts about danger. He caught Mira's gaze for a moment, and she saw recognition. There, the look of someone who knew the difference between official reassurance and actual safety. "Ma'am," Dr. Kessler tried again, his voice more urgent. "I really think we should consider Ms. Castellanos' earlier recommendations about health screening for personnel who've worked in that area. The symptoms she mentioned are completely normal for industrial work environments," Thornfield finished. "Dr. Kessler, I appreciate your thoroughness, but I won't have this situation escalated unnecessarily based on the speculations of a civilian contractor whose background is, at best, unclear." The dismissal was deliberate and public, designed to undermine both Kessler's judgment and Mira's credibility. Around the room, Mira could see personnel exchanging glances, some nodding agreement with their colonel, while others looked less certain. Lieutenant Okafor seemed particularly conflicted, his gaze moving between Thornfield's confident authority and the concerning data displays. "With respect, Colonel," Mira said quietly, finally unable to remain silent. "Environmental contamination doesn't follow rank structure. If there's a chance personnel have been exposed to something dangerous, Miss Castellanos." Thornfield's voice carried the full weight of military authority. "You are here as a consultant on routine maintenance issues. You are not qualified to assess emergency response protocols, and you are certainly not authorized to question command decisions regarding base security." The rebuke was sharp enough to cut, delivered with the practiced precision of someone accustomed to shutting down dissent. But Mira had faced worse intimidation from people far more dangerous than Colonel Thornfield. What worried her wasn't the personal attack, it was the growing certainty that people were going to get hurt while Thornfield protected her ego. "I understand the chain of command, Colonel, but chemical exposure doesn't recognize authority, and the readings Dr. Kessler is showing suggest this might be more serious than that's enough." Thornfield's voice rose to command level, silencing the room. "Dr. Kessler, I want you to focus on standard containment protocols. Sergeant Brennan, ensure all personnel maintain minimum safe distances from the affected building. Lieutenant Okafor, coordinate with base communications to prevent any unnecessary alarm among civilian personnel." She turned back to Mira with an expression of barely controlled anger. Miss Castellanos, your consultation services are no longer required. I suggest you collect your materials and leave the base immediately. The dismissal was final and public, designed to humiliate as much as remove. Around the room, Mira could see the mixed reactions, some personnel nodding approval of their colonel's decisive action, others looking uncomfortable with the harsh treatment of someone trying to help. Dr. Kessler appeared torn between supporting his contractor and maintaining his position with base command. But it was Sergeant Brennan who surprised everyone by speaking up. Ma'am, if I may, Ms. Castellanos did identify some concerning patterns in the storage area earlier. Maybe we should at least consider her observations before dismissing them entirely. Thornfield's attention snapped to Brennan with laser focus. Sergeant, are you questioning my assessment of this situation? The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Challenging a colonel's decision in public was career suicide for a non-commissioned officer, no matter how experienced. Brennan's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Mira thought he might back down. Instead, he straightened to attention. No, ma'am. I'm suggesting that in a potential contamination situation, we might want to gather all available information before making final decisions. The final decision has been made, Sergeant. Standard protocols will be followed, and unauthorized personnel will be removed from the area. Thornfield's gaze swept the room. Are there any other questions about the chain of command? Silence answered her, thick with unspoken tension. Mira could see Dr. Kessler staring at his tablet with growing alarm, but he'd been effectively silenced by the public demonstration of what happened to those who questioned the colonel's authority. Lieutenant Okafor looked like he wanted to speak but lacked the courage to risk his career. Even Sergeant Brennan had been forced back into line by the direct challenge to his loyalty. As Mira gathered her materials, she noticed Dr. Kessler's tablet screen showing readings that made her blood run cold. The contamination levels weren't decreasing, they were rising, and the chemical signatures were becoming more distinct. Whatever was leaking in that storage facility, it wasn't standard cleaning solvent. Dr. Kessler, she said quietly as she passed his chair, those readings suggest the leak is getting worse, not better. If I'm right about the chemical signature, standard containment protocols won't be adequate. He looked up at her with genuine fear in his eyes. What do you think it really is? Before she could answer, Thornfield's voice cut across the room. Miss Castellanos, I believe I made myself clear about your departure. Mira met the colonel's hostile gaze steadily. Of course. Colonel, I'll be leaving immediately. She paused at the door, knowing she might not get another chance to warn them. Dr. Kessler, if the readings continue to climb, you might want to expand the containment perimeter and consider respiratory protection for anyone working downwind of the facility. That won't be necessary, Thornfield said coldly. Good day, Miss Castellanos. As Mira walked toward the exit, she could hear hushed conversations breaking out behind her. Not everyone in that room was convinced by Thornfield's confident dismissal, but none of them had the authority or courage to challenge it directly. She'd seen this pattern before. Competent people forced to stand by while poor leadership created dangerous situations that could have been prevented. Outside the building, the afternoon air felt heavy with more than just humidity. Mira could detect the faint chemical signature she'd noticed earlier, stronger now and carrying on the wind toward the residential areas of the base. Whatever was happening in that storage facility, it was getting worse, and the only person in a position to stop it had just demonstrated that protecting her authority mattered more than protecting her personnel. Mira sat in her car for a moment, weighing her options. She could leave as ordered and hope that Thornfield's confidence was justified. Or she could find another way to help, even if it meant risking more than just her consulting contract. The decision was made for her when her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Building C getting worse. Need your help, can't say more. TB, Sergeant Brennan was reaching out, risking his career to get help for his people. Mira looked back toward the administrative building where Colonel Thornfield was probably congratulating herself on maintaining control, then started her engine and drove toward the base perimeter. She wasn't leaving. She was repositioning. Mira parked her Toyota at a truck stop 2 miles from the base, using the Wi-Fi to access secure communication channels she hadn't touched in 3 years. Her hands moved across the keyboard with muscle memory, navigating through encrypted networks that technically no longer existed for someone with her current clearance level. But old habits died hard, and some access codes were burned so deeply into memory that time couldn't erase them. The chemical signature she detected was bothering her more with each passing hour. It reminded her of something from her previous life, something classified so far above normal military operations that even thinking about it made her nervous. She pulled up spectral analysis software and began reconstructing the molecular patterns from memory, hoping she was wrong about what she suspected. Her phone buzzed with another message from Sergeant Brennan. Evacuation perimeter expanded to 500 meters. Official reason: equipment malfunction. Unofficial: 3 more personnel reporting respiratory symptoms. Mira's blood ran cold. Respiratory symptoms meant whatever was leaking had become airborne, and a 500-meter perimeter suggested someone with actual knowledge of chemical hazards was quietly overruling Thornfield's public stance. But it also meant the situation was deteriorating faster than official channels were. Acknowledging dot, she typed back, "What's the current wind direction?" "Southeast, toward family housing." The answer confirmed her worst fears. If the contamination was spreading downwind toward residential areas, they were looking at potential civilian casualties. Children, elderly residents, pregnant women, all the people most vulnerable to whatever was escaping from Storage Building C, back at the base. Dr. Vincent Kessler was experiencing his own crisis of confidence. His tablet showed readings that made no sense according to everything he thought he knew about the stored materials. The spectral analysis indicated molecular structures far more complex than simple industrial cleaning solvents. More troubling, the chemical signature showed characteristics he'd only seen in classified research papers dealing with synthetic biological agents. "Colonel," he said for the 4th time in an hour, approaching Thornfield's command post with growing desperation, "I really need to show you these latest readings. The contamination isn't behaving like any known industrial chemical." Thornfield barely looked up from her tactical display. "Dr. Kessler, I've already explained that we're following established protocols. The situation is contained." "But it's not contained," Kessler pressed, his usual diplomatic demeanor cracking under stress. "Look at these molecular patterns. This isn't cleaning solvent, it's something engineered. Something that shouldn't exist in our inventory." Finally, Thornfield gave him her full attention, but her expression was dangerous rather than concerned. "Dr. Kessler, are you suggesting that this base is storing unauthorized materials?" The question was loaded with implications that could destroy careers and trigger investigations reaching the highest levels of military command. Kessler realized he was walking into a minefield where the wrong answer could end his career, but the right answer might save lives. "I'm suggesting that whatever is in Storage Building C doesn't match our inventory records, and the contamination patterns suggest we're dealing with something far more dangerous than we've acknowledged." Lieutenant Derek Okafor had been listening from nearby, his young face pale with growing alarm. "Sir, if Dr. Kessler is right, shouldn't we be implementing higher-level containment protocols? Maybe even notifying regional command?" Thornfield's gaze shifted to Okafor with the focused intensity of a predator selecting prey. "Lieutenant, are you questioning my command judgment?" "No, ma'am. I'm just concerned about the safety protocols." "And your concern is noted and dismissed. We will not be escalating this situation based on speculation and fear-mongering." Thornfield's voice carried the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. Any personnel who cannot follow direct orders regarding this matter will be relieved of duty pending disciplinary review. The threat hung in the air like toxic vapor. Around the command post, other personnel suddenly found urgent reasons to focus on their individual tasks rather than the increasingly heated discussion. Okafor's face flushed with embarrassment and frustration, but he lacked the rank or experience to challenge a colonel's direct threat. Dr. Kessler felt the familiar weight of institutional pressure crushing down on professional integrity. He'd seen this pattern before in corporate environments, leadership so invested in their initial assessment that contradictory evidence became a personal attack requiring defensive response rather than adaptive thinking. Meanwhile, Sergeant Tyler Brennan was conducting his own unofficial investigation. 20 years of military service had taught him to read between the lines of official communications, and everything about the current situation felt wrong. The rapid expansion of the evacuation perimeter contradicted public statements about minor contamination. The involvement of specialized hazmat personnel suggested threats far beyond cleaning solvent spills. Most telling was the arrival of unmarked vehicles carrying personnel whose uniforms bore no identifying insignia. "Hey, Doc," he said, approaching Kessler during a brief lull in the crisis management. "Those readings you've been worried about, how bad are we talking?" Kessler glanced around nervously before responding in hushed tones. "Sergeant, I've been analyzing environmental hazards for 15 years. I've never seen molecular patterns like these. Whatever we're dealing with, it's not in any standard reference database." "Meaning what, exactly?" "Meaning it's either completely unknown, or it's classified so far above my clearance level that I'm not supposed to know it exists." Brennan absorbed this information with the steady calm of someone accustomed to bad news. "And the Colonel's response to this information has been what?" "Denial, deflection, and threats against anyone who suggests the situation might be more serious than her initial assessment." The sergeant nodded grimly. Military politics hadn't changed much in his 2 decades of service officers protecting their careers by refusing to acknowledge mistakes, even when those mistakes put lives at risk. But this felt different. The stakes seemed higher and the cover-up more desperate. "Sergeant Brennan," he said quietly, "that civilian contractor who got thrown out earlier, Ms. Castellanos, she seemed to know something about chemical contamination that the rest of us missed. She did indeed. Spotted problems that nobody else even noticed. Any chance she might be willing to provide unofficial consultation on this situation?" Brennan smiled for the first time that day. "Funny you should ask, Doc. I might have a way to reach out and see if she's still interested in helping." While these quiet conversations took place among the personnel actually dealing with the crisis, Colonel Thornfield was managing her own damage control operation. She'd placed calls to 3 different superior officers, crafting a narrative that positioned the current situation as a minor technical malfunction being resolved through proper protocols. Her focus wasn't on the chemical contamination. It was on preventing the kind of outside scrutiny that might reveal her handling of the crisis as inadequate. "The situation is completely under control," she assured General Patricia Hawkins during their 3rd conversation that afternoon. "A small leak of cleaning solvents, nothing more. We're following standard containment procedures, and I expect full resolution within 24 hours. Rebecca, I'm getting reports about expanded evacuation perimeters and respiratory symptoms among personnel. That doesn't sound like a minor cleaning solvent spill." Thornfield felt her carefully constructed narrative beginning to crack. "General, those are precautionary measures only. Some personnel have been experiencing anxiety-related symptoms, which is completely normal during any kind of emergency response." The lie came easily, polished by years of practice in managing information flow. But General Hawkins had her own sources of information, and the reports she was receiving painted a picture far different from Thornfield's reassuring updates. Rebecca, I want hourly updates on this situation. And if there's any indication that this is more serious than you're indicating, I want to know immediately. Of course, General. I'll keep you fully informed. As Thornfield ended the call, she realized that her window for maintaining control was rapidly closing. If the situation continued to escalate, questions would be asked that she couldn't answer. Worse, investigations might reveal that her decision to dismiss the civilian contractor had been based more on personal pride than sound judgment. She looked out her office window towards Storage Building C, where hazmat personnel in full protective gear were working to contain something she'd publicly described as harmless cleaning solvent. The disconnect between her official statements and the observable reality was becoming impossible to maintain. But admitting error now would mean admitting that a civilian contractor with questionable credentials had been right when military leadership had been wrong. It would mean acknowledging that lives might have been saved if she'd listened to expertise rather than protecting her authority. Colonel Rebecca Thornfield had built her career on never admitting mistakes. She wasn't about to start now, even if the alternative was watching the situation spiral completely out of control. The emergency call came at 1847 hours, just as the dinner shift was beginning in the base cafeteria. Lieutenant Derek Okafor's voice crackled over the emergency frequency with barely controlled panic. All units to Family Housing Complex Delta. We have multiple civilians down. Repeat, multiple civilian casualties at Family Housing Delta. In the command center, Colonel Thornfield felt her carefully constructed world begin to collapse. Family Housing Delta was directly downwind from Storage Building C, exactly where the contamination plume would have traveled if the situation was as serious as the people she'd dismissed had claimed. But admitting that now would mean acknowledging that her leadership had directly contributed to civilian casualties. Lieutenant Okafor, clarify your status report, she commanded, hoping against hope that this was some unrelated medical emergency. Ma'am, we have 6 families reporting severe respiratory distress. Symptoms include difficulty breathing, chemical burns on exposed skin, and several children showing signs of acute poisoning. Base Medical is requesting immediate evacuation to civilian hospitals with chemical decontamination capabilities. Dr. Vincent Kessler looked up from his monitoring station, his face ashen with the realization that his worst fears were being confirmed. In real time. Colonel, the chemical signature we've been tracking, those symptoms are consistent with exposure to the compound I identified earlier. The one that didn't match our inventory records. Thornfield's mind raced through damage control scenarios, but none of them offered a path that didn't end with her career in ruins. Civilian casualties from chemical exposure would trigger multiple investigations, and every decision she'd made over the past 8 hours would be scrutinized by people with far more authority than she possessed. Dr. Kessler, are you certain? The contamination from Storage Building C could have reached Family Housing Delta? It was a desperate question from someone hoping for a lifeline that didn't exist. Kessler consulted his wind pattern analysis and atmospheric modeling, then delivered the verdict that would haunt Thornfield for the rest of her career. Colonel, given the wind patterns and atmospheric conditions, contamination from Building C would have reached Family Housing Delta approximately 47 minutes ago. The timing matches exactly with when the first symptoms were reported. Sergeant Tyler Brennan appeared in the doorway of the command center, his expression grim, with the weight of confirmed casualties. Ma'am, Base Medical is requesting all available information about the contaminating agent. They need to know what they're treating if they're going to save these people. The request was reasonable, urgent, and completely impossible for Thornfield to fulfill without admitting that she'd been lying about the nature of the contamination for hours. Revealing the true chemical signature would raise questions about why proper protocols hadn't been followed, why warnings had been ignored, and why civilian areas hadn't been evacuated when the danger became apparent. Sergeant, our preliminary Analysis suggests industrial cleaning solvent exposure. Medical personnel should treat accordingly. Dr. Kessler's head snapped up in shock. Colonel, that's not accurate. The molecular signature indicates something far more complex than Dr. Kessler. Thornfield's voice carried the full weight of command authority and desperation. You will provide medical personnel with information about industrial solvent exposure protocols. Any other speculation is to be considered classified, pending further investigation. The order was direct, unmistakable, and completely contrary to everything Kessler understood about medical ethics and professional responsibility. Providing false information about a contaminating agent could lead to inappropriate treatment. That might kill the very people they were trying to save. Ma'am, I can't provide false medical information. Lives are at stake. You can and you will, Doctor. That's a direct order. The confrontation crystallized everything that had been building throughout the crisis. On one side stood professional competence, medical ethics, and genuine concern for human life. On the other stood institutional authority, career preservation, and the desperate need to maintain a narrative that was rapidly collapsing under the weight of observable reality. Lieutenant Okafor stepped forward, his young face pale but determined. Colonel, if I may, the medical teams are asking specifically about chemical warfare agent exposure protocols. They're seeing symptoms that don't match industrial solvent poisoning. Thornfield felt the walls closing in from all directions. Medical personnel were trained to recognize exposure patterns, and sophisticated hospital laboratories could identify molecular signatures that would reveal exactly what had been released. From Storage Building C, the truth was going to come out regardless of her orders, but admitting it now would mean taking responsibility for decisions that had led directly to civilian casualties. Lieutenant, you will inform medical personnel that we are dealing with industrial contamination. Period. Any suggestion of chemical warfare agents is to be considered unfounded speculation that could cause unnecessary panic. But even as she gave the order, Thornfield knew it was futile. Emergency responders were already collecting samples for analysis, and hospital laboratories would identify the true nature of the contaminating agent within hours. Her window for controlling the narrative had already closed, she just hadn't accepted it yet. Sergeant Brennan's radio crackled with an update from the medical teams. Command, we have 2 children in critical condition. Doctors are requesting immediate consultation with chemical warfare specialists. Repeat requesting. Chemical warfare specialist consultation immediately. The words hung in the air like an indictment. Chemical warfare specialists weren't called for cleaning solvent exposure. They were called when medical teams recognized exposure patterns associated with weaponized chemical or biological agents, exactly the kind of agents that weren't supposed to exist in routine storage facilities. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dr. Kessler stood up slowly, his decision written clearly on his face. Colonel, I'm sorry, but I can't follow that order. I'm calling the Regional Poison Control Center and providing them with the actual chemical analysis. Those children's lives matter more than any classification level or chain of command. Dr. Kessler, if you make that call, you'll be relieved of duty and face court-martial for revealing classified information. Then court-martial me. But I won't let children die to protect someone's career. The standoff represented everything that had gone wrong with the crisis response. Professional expertise was being threatened with criminal prosecution for trying to save lives, while command authority was being used to maintain lies that were directly contributing to civilian casualties. Lieutenant Okafor found his voice, strengthened by the moral clarity of the moment. Ma'am, I volunteer to make the call to poison control. If Dr. Kessler faces court-martial, I'll face it with him. Sergeant Brennan nodded his agreement. Me too, Colonel. These people didn't sign up to be poisoned by chemicals we won't even identify properly. For the first time in her career, Colonel Thornfield faced open revolt from her own personnel. Not because they questioned military authority, but because they recognized that true leadership meant protecting people rather than protecting narratives. The choice was clear: maintain her position through threats and intimidation, or admit that civilian contractors and junior personnel had been right when she had been catastrophically wrong. "You're all relieved of duty," she said, her voice hollow with the recognition that she'd lost control completely. "Report to your quarters pending disciplinary review." But as her personnel filed out to save lives despite her orders, Thornfield realized that relieving them of duty wouldn't stop the truth from emerging. Medical teams would identify the contaminating agent. Investigations would reveal the sequence of decisions that had led to civilian casualties. Most damaging of all, records would show that warnings had been given by qualified personnel and ignored by command authority. She picked up the secure phone to call General Hawkins, knowing that this conversation would end her career. But first, she had to figure out how to explain that a situation she'd described as minor, cleaning solvent contamination, had somehow resulted in children fighting for their lives in chemical decontamination units. Outside her office, the base was mobilizing resources for a crisis that had been completely preventable. Emergency vehicles raced toward Family Housing Delta, their sirens wailing a funeral dirge for Colonel Thornfield's military career and the illusion that authority could trump expertise indefinitely. The breaking point had arrived, and everything that happened next would be measured against the simple question: how many people had to suffer before someone with actual knowledge was allowed to help? Mira's phone exploded with desperate messages as news of the civilian casualties spread through unofficial channels. Sergeant Brennan's texts painted a picture of complete command breakdown. Medical teams requesting information that Colonel Thornfield refused to provide, children in critical condition being treated for the wrong type of exposure, and base personnel openly defying orders to save lives. "Need your help now," Brennan's latest message read. "Kids dying, Colonel lying about contamination type, medical teams treating wrong agent. Can you identify what we're really dealing with?" From her position at the truck stop, Mira could see emergency vehicles streaming toward the base, their red and blue lights cutting through the gathering dusk like warning beacons. She'd been monitoring emergency radio frequencies, and the traffic painted a horrifying picture of chemical casualties that could have been prevented if anyone had listened to her warnings 8 hours earlier. But what truly chilled her blood was the chemical analysis she'd completed using her classified database access. The molecular signature she'd detected wasn't just dangerous, it was impossible. According to every official record, the compound she'd identified didn't exist. It had been developed, tested, and then supposedly destroyed in a program so classified that acknowledging its existence would trigger congressional investigations and international incidents. She stared at her laptop screen, where the spectral analysis showed an unmistakable match for compound VX7, a synthetic biological agent that officially had never been successfully synthesized. But here it was, leaking from a routine storage facility and poisoning children, whose only crime was living downwind from a cover-up. Her secure phone rang with an incoming call from a number she hadn't seen in 3 years. The caller ID showed only oversight, but she knew exactly who it was. Dr. Castellanos. The voice belonged to Director James Morrison, her former handler in the classified biological weapons program. "I understand you've encountered something that might require our attention." The use of her doctorate title and formal surname told her this was an official call, which meant someone very high up the intelligence food chain was monitoring the Padang situation at Granite Ridge. It also meant her cover as a simple environmental consultant had been blown the moment she'd started accessing classified databases. "Director Morrison, I take it you're aware of the situation here." "We're aware that a containment breach has occurred involving materials that shouldn't exist in routine military storage." We're also aware that local command has been less than forthcoming about the nature of the contamination. Mira felt a familiar chill at the carefully neutral language. In the world of classified operations, phrases like less than forthcoming usually meant someone was about to disappear into a legal black hole. But right now, her only concern was stopping more children from dying. Director, VX7 exposure requires specific antidotes that aren't available through normal medical channels. If those kids are being treated for industrial solvent poisoning, they're going to die. Dr. Castellanos, I need you to understand something very clearly. VX7 doesn't exist. It was never successfully synthesized, never tested, and certainly never stored at a routine military installation. Any suggestion to the contrary would be considered a serious breach of national security protocols. The threat was delivered with bureaucratic politeness, but Mira recognized it for what it was, a direct order to maintain the cover-up even at the cost of civilian lives. She'd heard similar instructions during her years in the program, usually when operations went wrong. And damage control became more important than damage prevention. So I'm supposed to let children die to protect a classification level? You're supposed to remember that some secrets are more important than individual casualties. The existence of VX7 cannot be acknowledged under any circumstances. Mira closed, her eyes feeling the weight of impossible choices. She'd joined the biological weapons program believing she was protecting national security. She'd left it when she realized that national security too often became an excuse for protecting institutional failures. Now she was being asked to choose between her oath of secrecy and her basic humanity. Director, what if there was a way to provide the necessary medical information without acknowledging the classified nature of the agent? Theoretical treatment protocols for hypothetical exposure scenarios? A long pause suggested Morrison was consulting with higher authorities. Dr. Castellanos, any information you provide must be completely deniable. No direct references to specific agents, no acknowledgement of classified programs, no paper trail that could be traced back to official sources. Understood, but I need immunity for any actions I take to provide that information. You have it, with the understanding that if you deviate from deniable parameters, that immunity disappears instantly. The call ended, leaving Mira alone with the most difficult decision of her life. She could provide the medical information needed to save those children, but only by violating every security protocol she'd sworn to uphold. And if she was caught making direct references to classified programs, she'd face prosecution that could end with life imprisonment or worse. Her phone buzzed with another desperate message from Brennan. 2 more kids critical. Doctors saying treatment not working. Whatever we're dealing with, it's not responding to normal protocols. Mira looked toward the base, where emergency lights painted the evening sky with urgent reds and blues. Somewhere in those buildings, children were dying because adults were more concerned with protecting secrets than protecting lives. She'd spent 3 years trying to escape this world of impossible choices and moral compromises, but the world had found her again. She opened her laptop and began typing a message that would either save lives or destroy her own. Sergeant Brennan, pass this information to medical teams immediately. Tell them it's theoretical treatment protocols for hypothetical exposure to synthetic biological agents. Do not mention my name or ask where this information came from. What followed was detailed medical information about treating VX7 exposure, specific antidotes, dosage calculations, and supportive care protocols that existed nowhere in public medical literature. Every word she typed was a felony under national security laws, but every word might also save a child's life. Meanwhile, back at the base, the situation was deteriorating beyond any possibility of containment. Dr. Sophia Nakamura, the chief emergency physician at the base hospital, was growing increasingly frustrated with the disconnect between the symptoms she was treating and the information she was receiving from command. "These aren't industrial solvent exposures," she told her staff for the third time. "The neurological symptoms, the respiratory patterns, the way the contamination is affecting cellular metabolism. This is something engineered, something that doesn't occur naturally." Her requests for accurate chemical information had been denied repeatedly, with Colonel Thornfield's staff insisting that all necessary information had been provided. But Dr. Nakamura had spent 2 years working with chemical casualties in Syria, and she knew the difference between accidental exposure and weaponized agents. When Brennan's message arrived with detailed treatment protocols, she recognized immediately that someone with access to classified medical knowledge was trying to help. The information was too specific, too accurate, and too effective to come from any public source. "Where did this come from?" she asked Brennan quietly. "Doc, I honestly don't know. But does it matter if it saves these kids?" She looked at the treatment protocols, comparing them to the symptoms her patients were showing. Everything matched perfectly. Dosage calculations had accounted for the specific way this agent affected pediatric metabolism, antidote combinations that targeted the exact neurological pathways being damaged, supportive care measures designed for this specific type of exposure. "Sergeant, whoever sent this information knows exactly what poisoned these children. This isn't theoretical knowledge, this is specific expertise with this exact agent." Dr. Nakamura made her decision with the same moral clarity that had driven Dr. Kessler and Lieutenant Okafor to defy their orders. She began implementing the treatment protocols immediately, knowing that questions about their source would come later. Right now she had children to save. Within 30 minutes, the youngest patients began showing improvement. Respiratory distress decreased, neurological symptoms stabilized, and the cellular damage that had been progressing rapidly began to slow. The protocols worked with a precision that confirmed Dr. Nakamura's suspicions about their classified origin. But as the medical crisis stabilized, the political crisis was just beginning. Someone with access to highly classified information was operating outside official channels, and that meant security investigations that would eventually lead back to Mira. Her window for maintaining anonymity was rapidly closing, and soon she'd have to decide whether to run or stand and face the consequences of saving lives. The black SUVs arrived at the truck stop at 2,143 hours, their occupants moving with the practiced efficiency of people accustomed to making problems disappear. Mira had been expecting them since the moment she'd sent those treatment protocols, but she'd chosen to stay anyway. Running would only confirm guilt, and more importantly, there might still be people who needed help. She closed her laptop calmly as 6 agents in dark suits surrounded her vehicle. Their leader, a woman in her 40s with silver-streaked hair and eyes like winter ice, approached the driver's side window with a federal identification that read, "Agent Patricia Cross, Department of Defense Intelligence. Dr. Mira Castellanos, you need to come with us." It wasn't a request. Mira nodded and stepped out of her car, submitting to handcuffs that were applied with professional courtesy, but unmistakable finality. As they drove back toward Granite Ridge, Agent Cross briefed her on the situation with bureaucratic precision. "You're being detained under the National Security Act for potential violations of classified information protocols. Your electronic communications have been monitored, and your recent database access has been logged. You'll undergo full decontamination. Screening before questioning begins." "Decontamination screening?" Mira asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "Standard protocol when someone has potentially been exposed to classified biological agents. Can't have you carrying unknown substances into secure facilities." The decontamination facility was a sterile complex of white corridors and clinical chambers that felt more like a laboratory than a detention center. Military police escorted Mira through multiple security checkpoints, each one scanning her identification and logging her progress deeper into the classified world she'd tried to leave behind. Dr. Castellanos, announced Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the facility's medical officer. "You'll need to remove all clothing and personal items for full decontamination protocol. Everything will be inventoried and returned after processing." The process was designed to be humiliating as much as thorough, another way of emphasizing the power differential between classified programs and the individuals who fell within their scope. Mira complied without complaint, understanding that resistance would only make things worse. Standing in the sterile chamber, wearing nothing but a medical gown, she watched through reinforced glass as technicians prepared the radiation and biological scanning equipment. These weren't routine contamination detectors. They were sophisticated systems designed to identify exposure to agents that didn't officially exist. "Please step onto the scanning platform," Dr. Harper instructed through the intercom. "Remain perfectly still while the system conducts its analysis." The scanner hummed to life, its sensors moving in complex patterns around Mira's body. She could see the readouts on the technicians' screens, but couldn't make out the specific data from her position. What she could see were the technicians' faces and the growing alarm in their expressions as the scan progressed. "Dr. Harper," one of the technicians called out, his voice tight with confusion, "you need to see these readings." The medical officer approached the console, her professional composure giving way to shock as she read the display. She looked up at Mira through the glass, then back at the screen, then picked up a secure phone to make a call that would change everything. "This is Dr. Harper at Granite Ridge Decontamination. I need to speak with Director Morrison immediately. We have a code black situation." Agent Cross appeared at the observation window, her earlier confidence replaced by carefully controlled alarm. "Dr. Harper, what exactly are you seeing?" "The radiation scanner is detecting exposure markers consistent with multiple classified biological agents. Not recent exposure, historical exposure patterns, indicating direct contact with substances from the Omega Black program." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Omega Black was the most classified biological weapons program in U.S. history. So secret that acknowledging its existence was considered an act of treason. Only 17 people had ever been directly exposed to Omega Black agents, and their identities were classified beyond top secret. Agent Cross stared at Mira through the glass with new understanding. "Dr. Castellanos, what aren't you telling us about your background?" Before Mira could answer, the scanner display began showing additional readings that made Dr. Harper's face go white with shock. The system wasn't just detecting exposure markers, it was identifying specific agents that officially had never been successfully synthesized. "Agent Cross," Dr. Harper said quietly, "according to these readings, she's been exposed to VX7, VX12, and at least 3 other biological agents that don't exist in any official database. The exposure pattern suggests direct contact during testing or deployment scenarios." The implications crashed over the observation room like a tidal wave. Mira wasn't just someone who'd accessed classified information. She was someone who'd lived through classified programs that were so secret their very existence could destabilize international relations. Agent Cross picked up her secure phone. "Director Morrison, we have a problem. The environmental consultant you told us to detain, she's not a consultant. According to decontamination scans, she's a survivor of the Omega Black program." The phone conversation that followed was conducted in hushed tones, but Mira could see the effect it was having on everyone in the observation room. Personnel were stepping back from the windows, additional security was being called in, and Dr. Harper was consulting protocols for handling individuals with her level of exposure history. "Director," Morrison's voice crackled through the intercom when he patched into the facility's communication system. "Dr. Castellanos, it appears your background is more complex than you initially indicated. We need to discuss your involvement in certain classified programs that officially never existed." Mira looked directly at the observation window, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd been through interrogations far more intense than this one. Director, my involvement in the Omega Black program ended 3 years ago when I requested transfer to civilian consulting. I've maintained my security clearances and honored all classification protocols until tonight. Until you provided classified medical treatment protocols to save civilian lives, Morrison corrected. Until I provided theoretical treatment information. For hypothetical exposure scenarios, Mira countered, using the exact language he'd approved during their phone conversation. Nothing I shared acknowledged the existence of any specific agents or programs. The legal dance was delicate but crucial. If Morrison tried to prosecute her for revealing classified information, he'd have to acknowledge in court that the information she'd revealed was real. That would mean admitting the existence of biological weapons programs that violated international treaties and congressional oversight requirements. Agent Cross realized the bind they were in. Dr. Castellanos, your scanner readings indicate survival of exposure to agents that officially don't exist. That makes you either a security asset or a security threat of the highest order. Which am I, Agent Cross? The question hung in the sterile air of the decontamination chamber, loaded with implications that reached far beyond Mira's individual case. Someone with her exposure history and classified knowledge couldn't simply be released back into civilian life, but prosecuting her would require acknowledging programs that were buried so deeply that even mentioning them was considered treasonous. Dr. Harper consulted her medical protocols for handling Omega Black survivors. Agent Cross, according to these procedures, individuals with Dr. Castellanos' exposure profile are to be treated as invaluable intelligence assets. The medical knowledge she possesses about treating exposure to these agents is literally irreplaceable. The scanner continued its analysis, revealing layer after layer of exposure markers that painted a picture of someone who'd not only survived the most dangerous biological weapons ever created, but had developed immunity to agents that killed every other test subject. She wasn't just a security risk, she was a walking repository of medical knowledge that could save lives in scenarios that weren't supposed to exist. As the implications sank in, Agent Cross realized that they weren't dealing with a security breach. They were dealing with the one person on Earth who could have prevented the tragedy at Granite Ridge if anyone had bothered to check her real background before dismissing her as an unqualified consultant. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. As Mira stood in the sterile white chamber, her dignity stripped away along with her clothes, while the scanner displayed the truth that would change everything. Classified bioweapon survivor clearance level, Omega Black, but now instead of being a threat to be contained, she'd become the most valuable person in the room. The transformation in the decontamination facility was immediate and dramatic. Within minutes of the scanner revelation, Agent Cross was no longer treating Mira as a detained suspect, but as a critical intelligence asset whose expertise could mean the difference between containing the crisis and watching it spiral into a national security disaster. Dr. Castellanos, Director Morrison's voice through the intercom had taken on a completely different tone, respectful, urgent, almost pleading. We need your immediate assistance in assessing the full scope of the contamination at Granite Ridge. Your unique background makes you the only person qualified to determine what we're really dealing with. Mira was provided with clean clothes. Her personal items were returned, and the handcuffs were replaced with a security escort that felt more like protective detail than detention. The shift in treatment would have been amusing if children weren't still fighting for their lives because of preventable incompetence. Before I provide any assistance, Mira said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who now held all the cards, I want full disclosure about how VX-7 ended up in a routine storage facility. And I want Colonel Thornfield's immediate removal from command of this situation. Agent Cross exchanged glances with Dr. Harper, both recognizing that they were no longer negotiating from a position of strength. Dr. Castellanos will provide what information we can, but some details remain classified even at your level. Agent Cross, I survived direct exposure to VX7 during its initial testing phase. I helped develop the medical countermeasures that are currently saving those children's lives. My clearance level gives me access to information that most cabinet members don't know exists. Mira's tone was calm but implacable. So let's try again. How did a biological weapon that was supposedly destroyed end up poisoning civilians at a routine military installation? The silence that followed was answer enough. Someone had been storing classified biological agents at Granite Ridge without proper authorization, safety protocols, or even accurate inventory records. The kind of bureaucratic failure that could topple governments if it became public knowledge. Director Morrison's voice returned to the intercom with obvious reluctance. Dr. Castellanos, certain materials from the Omega Black program were relocated to secondary storage sites following the official program termination. Granite Ridge was designated as a temporary storage location pending final disposal. Temporary storage in facilities without proper containment protocols, monitored by personnel without appropriate clearances, and inventoried as industrial cleaning supplies. Mira's voice carried the ice-cold fury of a professional who'd seen too many preventable disasters caused by institutional arrogance. The classification requirements made standard storage protocols complicated. The classification requirements made proper storage protocols inconvenient, Mira corrected. So someone decided to hide biological weapons in routine facilities, rather than deal with the oversight that proper storage would require. Meanwhile, back at the base command center, Colonel Thornfield was experiencing her own reckoning. General Patricia Hawkins had arrived from Regional Command with a full investigation team, and the comfortable fiction of minor cleaning solvent. Contamination had collapsed completely under the weight of civilian casualties and congressional inquiries. Colonel Thornfield, General Hawkins's voice carried the kind of controlled fury reserved for career-ending failures. Explain to me how a situation you described as routine maintenance became a chemical weapons incident requiring federal intervention. Thornfield stood at attention, her earlier confidence replaced by the hollow look of someone watching 30 years of military service evaporate in real time. General, the initial assessment suggested industrial contamination. When the situation escalated, I followed established protocols for You followed protocols for covering your ass while children were being poisoned by biological weapons. General Hawkins cut her off. And when qualified personnel tried to warn you about the real nature of the threat, you had them arrested for insubordination. The briefing room was packed with federal investigators, congressional liaison officers, and medical specialists all taking notes that would become part of the official record of one of the most catastrophic leadership failures in recent military history. Thornfield realized that every decision she'd made over the past 12 hours was being scrutinized by people with the authority to end not just her career, but her freedom. General, I was not informed that the storage facility contained anything other than routine industrial chemicals, because you refused to listen when people with actual expertise tried to inform you. Came a new voice from the doorway. Dr. Sophia Nakamura entered the briefing room with medical charts in her hands, and exhaustion etched in her face. Colonel, your orders specifically prohibited medical personnel from receiving accurate information about the contaminating agent. Children nearly died because you prioritized maintaining your authority over providing life-saving information. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Around the room, investigators made notes while congressional liaisons whispered into secure phones. This wasn't just a military failure, it was the kind of systemic breakdown that would require testimony before congressional committees and independent oversight boards. Sergeant Tyler Brennan appeared beside Dr. Nakamura, his weathered face set with determination. "General, I have documented communications showing that Colonel Thornfield was repeatedly warned about the severity of the contamination by qualified personnel. When we tried to provide accurate medical information to save civilian lives, we were threatened with court-martial." General Hawkins looked around the room at the assembled evidence of command failure, then fixed her attention on Thornfield with the focus of a prosecutor making a closing argument. "Colonel, it appears that your response to this crisis consisted primarily of threatening subordinates who tried to do their jobs and covering up the true nature of a biological weapons incident." Before Thornfield could respond, Agent Cross entered the briefing room with an announcement that would complete her professional destruction. "General Hawkins, we've confirmed that the environmental consultant Colonel Thornfield dismissed and attempted to have arrested is actually Dr. Mira Castellanos, a classified biological weapons specialist with Omega Black clearance." The room went silent except for the sound of pens frantically scribbling notes. Congressional liaisons looked up from their phones with expressions of barely contained horror. Investigators stopped taking notes to stare at Thornfield with the kind of fascination usually reserved for natural disasters. "You're telling me," General Hawkins said slowly, "that Colonel Thornfield dismissed and attempted to arrest the one person in this entire region who was actually qualified to handle a biological weapons incident?" "Yes, ma'am," Dr. Castellanos correctly identified the contaminating agent, predicted the exposure patterns, and ultimately provided the medical information that saved the civilian casualties, all while being officially excluded from the response effort. The implications were staggering. Not only had Thornfield failed to properly handle the crisis, she'd actively prevented the most qualified person available from helping to resolve it. Worse, she'd done so based on personal pride and institutional prejudice rather than any legitimate security concerns. Lieutenant Derek Okafor stepped forward, his young face pale but determined. "General, I was present when Dr. Castellanos warned about the wind patterns that would carry contamination toward civilian areas. Colonel Thornfield dismissed those warnings and threatened disciplinary action against anyone who supported evacuation." Recommendations. Dr. Vincent Kessler joined the growing chorus of testimony against his former commander. "Ma'am, Dr. Castellanos identified molecular signatures that I missed entirely. When I tried to report her findings, I was ordered to provide false information to medical teams treating civilian casualties. The pattern was clear and damning. Every decision that could have prevented or mitigated the crisis had been made by personnel Colonel Thornfield had dismissed, threatened, or actively obstructed. Every decision that had worsened the crisis had come directly from her command authority. General Hawkins looked at the assembled evidence of systemic failure, then made the announcement that everyone in the room had been expecting. "Colonel Thornfield, you are hereby relieved of command pending full investigation by the Inspector General's office. You will surrender your command authorization and report to detention pending criminal review." As military police stepped forward to escort Thornfield from the room, Agent Cross delivered the final blow to her career and reputation. "Colonel, Dr. Castellanos has been appointed as the lead technical advisor for the cleanup and investigation of this incident. You'll be answering to the person you tried to have arrested." The irony was perfect and devastating. The woman whose expertise had been dismissed would now be directing the efforts to clean up the mess created by that dismissal. The authority figure who'd prioritized control over competence would face investigation, led by the person whose competence she'd refused to acknowledge. As Thornfield was led away in handcuffs, the remaining personnel in the briefing room began the complex work of understanding how institutional arrogance had nearly resulted in mass civilian casualties. But the most important lesson was already clear. Expertise has its own authority, and ignoring that expertise comes with consequences that no amount of institutional power can overcome. Dr. Mira Castellanos returned to storage building C 12 hours after being dismissed as an unqualified consultant. But this time she wore full hazmat gear and carried the authority of federal oversight. The building that had been the source of so much preventable suffering now stood surrounded by specialized containment equipment, decontamination units, and the kind of federal response team that arrives when routine problems become national security incidents. Dr. Castellanos, Agent Cross briefed her as they approached the facility. "We've established a containment perimeter, but we need your assessment of the long-term mental impact. Our standard protocols aren't designed for agents that officially don't exist." Mira surveyed the scene with the practiced eye of someone who'd managed biological weapons incidents in theaters of war. The improvised containment measures were adequate for preventing further immediate exposure, but the sophisticated molecular structure of VX7 meant that standard decontamination procedures would be largely ineffective. Agent Cross, VX7 forms molecular bonds with organic materials that can persist for decades. Everything in that building, the walls, the floor, the ventilation system, is now a potential source of secondary contamination. Standard chemical decontamination won't be sufficient. General Patricia Hawkins, who'd been observing the conversation, stepped forward with obvious concern. "Dr. Castellanos, what are you recommending? Complete demolition?" "More complex than that, General. VX7 requires thermal decomposition at temperatures exceeding 1,200 degrees Celsius, followed by specialized neutralizing agents that aren't available through normal supply channels. We're looking at a months-long process requiring equipment and materials that will raise questions about why we need them." The implications were staggering. Properly cleaning up the contamination would require acknowledging the existence of VX7, which would trigger congressional investigations into illegal biological weapons storage. But failing to clean it up properly would leave a permanent environmental hazard that could poison anyone who entered the area for the next several decades. Dr. Sophia Nakamura joined the discussion, her medical expertise adding another layer of complexity to the situation. "Dr. Castellanos, what about the personnel who were exposed during the initial leak? Will they need long-term medical monitoring?" Mira consulted her tablet, reviewing exposure data and medical records with the same precision she'd once applied to battlefield casualty assessments. "Dr. Nakamura, VX7 exposure can cause delayed onset symptoms appearing weeks or months after initial contact. Everyone who worked in or near that building over the past month needs comprehensive blood work and baseline neurological assessments." "How comprehensive?" General Hawkins asked, though her expression suggested she already suspected the answer would be problematic. "Full genetic sequencing to check for cellular damage, quarterly neurological evaluations for the next 5 years, and specialized blood tests that will require explaining to medical personnel why we're screening for agents that don't officially exist." The medical monitoring requirements created the same impossible bind as the environmental cleanup. Providing adequate care would require acknowledging classified programs, but failing to provide adequate care would mean allowing preventable health problems to develop in exposed personnel. Sergeant Tyler Brennan approached the group with a tablet containing base personnel records. "Dr. Castellanos, I've identified 43 individuals who worked in or near Building C over the past 6 weeks. That includes maintenance workers, security personnel, and administrative staff who had no idea they were being exposed to biological weapons." Mira reviewed the list, cross-referencing work schedules with exposure estimates and contamination spread patterns. Her analysis painted a picture of systematic exposure that could have been prevented if proper storage protocols had been followed or if warnings had been heeded when they were first given. "Sergeant, based on these exposure patterns, we're looking at potential long-term health effects for most of these individuals. The civilians who live downwind will need monitoring as well. which means involving health agencies that don't have appropriate security clearances. Lieutenant Derek Okafor, who'd been quietly observing the complexity of the cleanup effort, finally spoke up. "Dr. Castellanos, how do we handle the families who were evacuated? They're asking when they can return home, and what health risks they might face going forward." It was the question everyone had been avoiding: how to provide adequate medical care and honest risk assessment to civilians without revealing that they'd been exposed to biological weapons that weren't supposed to exist. The families deserved to know what they'd been exposed to and what health effects to watch for. But providing that information would require acknowledging classification violations that reached the highest levels of government. Mira looked around at the assembled military and federal personnel, recognizing the familiar pattern of institutional paralysis when secrecy conflicted with public safety. She'd seen the same dynamic during her years in the Omega Black program situations where protecting classified information became more important than protecting the people that classification was supposed to serve. "Agent Cross, I need to speak with Director Morrison directly. We're dealing with a situation where standard security protocols are actively preventing us from protecting civilian lives. The secure communication was established within minutes, connecting the field response team with the highest levels of biological weapons oversight." Morrison's voice carried the tension of someone managing a crisis that threatened to expose decades of questionable decisions. "Dr. Castellanos, what's your assessment of the contamination scope?" "Director, we're looking at environmental contamination that will persist for decades without proper cleanup, medical exposure that will require long-term monitoring for dozens of personnel, and civilian families who've been exposed to biological agents they can't be told about. The cover-up is becoming more dangerous than the original incident." "Dr. Castellanos, you understand the national security implications of acknowledging VX-7's existence." "Sir, I understand that continuing to hide its existence will result in preventable deaths from exposure complications that won't be properly diagnosed or treated. We've reached the point where protecting the secret is causing more damage than revealing it." The silence that followed stretched across the secure connection like a held breath. Morrison was being forced to choose between maintaining plausible deniability about illegal weapons programs and protecting the health of exposed civilians. Exactly the kind of impossible choice that classified programs created when they went wrong. "Dr. Castellanos, what would you recommend?" Mira had been preparing for this question since the moment the scanner revealed her background. "Sir, we need to acknowledge VX-7's existence through limited disclosure to selected medical personnel and environmental specialists. Provide them with the information necessary to monitor and treat exposed individuals without revealing the full scope of the weapons program. That's a significant security risk." "Director, the alternative is allowing dozens of people to develop preventable health problems because we won't tell their doctors what they were exposed to. The security risk of limited disclosure is manageable. The moral and legal risk of allowing preventable suffering is not." Dr. Nakamura stepped closer to the communication equipment. "Director Morrison, this is Dr. Nakamura, Chief of Emergency Medicine. I've been treating the civilian casualties, and I need to know what long-term effects to monitor for. Without accurate information about the contaminating agent, I can't provide adequate care." "Dr. Nakamura, what Dr. Castellanos has told you should be sufficient for immediate treatment." "Sir, with respect, it's not sufficient for long-term care. These families need to know what health risks they face and what symptoms to watch for. I can't provide that guidance without knowing exactly what they were exposed to." The conversation highlighted the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the crisis: the need to protect classified information conflicting directly with the need to protect exposed civilians. Morrison was being forced to choose between security and safety. With no good options available, General Hawkins joined the conversation with the authority of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions under pressure. "Director, I'm recommending That we authorize limited disclosure to selected medical and environmental personnel under expanded security protocols. The alternative is accepting responsibility for preventable casualties to protect a program that's already been compromised. After a long pause, Morrison's voice returned with the resignation of someone accepting inevitable consequences. Dr. Castellanos, you're authorized to provide limited technical information to qualified personnel for medical and environmental purposes only. All recipients will be required to sign security agreements, and any unauthorized disclosure will be prosecuted to the full extent of federal law. Mira felt a weight lifting from her shoulders, not the weight of personal responsibility, but the institutional weight of being forced to choose between following orders and protecting lives. For the first time since the crisis began, she'd be able to provide the information necessary to properly protect exposed civilians without violating her security oaths. Understood, Director. I'll begin briefing medical personnel immediately. As the communication ended, Agent Cross looked at Mira with new respect. Dr. Castellanos, you just forced the federal government to partially declassify a biological weapons program to protect civilian health. That's not something that happens very often. Agent Cross, classified programs exist to protect national security, not to protect bureaucrats from the consequences of poor decisions. When secrecy starts causing more harm than it prevents, it's time to reevaluate priorities. The cleanup of Storage Building C would take months and cost millions of dollars. The medical monitoring of exposed personnel would continue for years. But for the first time since the crisis began, the response was being guided by expertise rather than ego, and by concern for human welfare rather than institutional protection. Dr. Mira Castellanos had proven that competence could triumph over authority, even when that authority was backed by the full weight of classified programs and federal law. The question now was whether the lessons learned from this preventable disaster would be applied to prevent similar crises in the future. The congressional hearing room was packed beyond capacity, with journalists, military personnel, and families of exposed civilians filling every available seat. The Subcommittee on National Security Oversight had convened emergency hearings to investigate what the media had dubbed the Granite Ridge incident, a sanitized name for what insiders knew was one of the most serious biological weapons accidents in American history. Colonel Rebecca Thornfield sat at the witness table in civilian clothes. Her military career officially ended by court-martial proceedings that had found her guilty of criminal negligence, failure to follow proper safety protocols, and obstruction of federal investigations. The confident authority that had once defined her command presence had been replaced by the hollow look of someone watching their life's work crumble in public. Congressman Michael Rodriguez, the subcommittee chairman, consulted his notes before beginning the questioning that would be broadcast across national news networks. Colonel Thornfield, this committee has reviewed extensive documentation regarding your handling of the biological contamination incident, Granite Ridge Military Installation. Can you explain to the American people how a routine environmental consultation became a federal emergency requiring the partial declassification of weapons programs? Thornfield's legal counsel had prepared her for this question, but no amount of preparation could make her answer sound reasonable to people who understood the basic facts of the case. Congressman, I followed established protocols for responding to chemical contamination incidents. When the situation escalated beyond initial assessments, I implemented standard emergency procedures. Standard emergency procedures? Congressman Rodriguez's voice carried the kind of controlled outrage that comes from reviewing classified briefings about preventable disasters. Colonel, you were warned repeatedly by qualified personnel that the contamination was more serious than your initial assessment. You dismissed those warnings and threatened disciplinary action against anyone who questioned your judgment. The exchange was being broadcast live on C-SPAN, with major networks providing commentary about the implications of a military commander prioritizing ego over public safety. But for the families sitting in the gallery, families whose children had been poisoned by preventable exposure to biological weapons, this wasn't political theater. It was accountability for decisions that had nearly cost them their children's lives. Dr. Sophia Nakamura sat at her own witness table, having been called to testify about the medical response to the crisis. Her testimony had been devastating in its clinical precision, documenting how Thornfield's orders had prevented proper treatment of civilian casualties. Dr. Nakamura, asked Congresswoman Sarah Chun, in your medical opinion, would the civilian casualties have been prevented if accurate information about the contaminating agent had been provided to response personnel? Congresswoman, absolutely. The symptoms these children experienced were entirely consistent with VX7 exposure, but we were told we were treating industrial solvent poisoning. If we'd had accurate information from the beginning, we could have administered proper antidotes immediately instead of losing critical hours with inappropriate treatment. And the source of that accurate information was ultimately Dr. Mira Castellanos, the civilian consultant who was dismissed and nearly arrested by Colonel Thornfield. Yes, ma'am, Dr. Castellanos provided the treatment protocols that saved those children's lives, even though she was officially excluded from the response effort. The irony was stark and publicly humiliating for Thornfield. The person she dismissed as unqualified had ultimately been the only one capable of preventing the disaster she'd created through her own incompetence. Mira herself had testified earlier in closed session, her Omega Black clearance making public testimony impossible. But leaked summaries of her testimony had painted a picture of systematic institutional failure that went far beyond one commander's poor judgment. Her classified briefing had revealed that VX7 and other biological agents were being stored at dozens of routine military installations across the country, all without proper safety protocols or accurate inventory management. Sergeant Tyler Brennan took his turn at the witness table with the kind of straightforward honesty that cut through political rhetoric like a blade. When asked about his decision to secretly contact Dr. Castellanos for help, his answer was simple and devastating. Congressman, children were dying, and the person in charge was more worried about protecting her authority than protecting lives. I made the choice that any decent human being would make. I asked for help from someone who actually knew what they were talking about. Sergeant, you risked court-martial to contact Dr. Castellanos. Do you regret that decision? Brennan looked directly at the families in the gallery, his weathered face set with absolute certainty. Sir, the only thing I regret is that it took me so long to reach out. If I'd contacted her sooner, those kids might not have gotten sick at all. The testimony continued for 3 days, painting a picture of institutional arrogance that had nearly resulted in mass civilian casualties. Personnel after personnel testified about Thornfield's refusal to listen to expert advice, her threats against subordinates who tried to provide accurate information, and her systematic prioritization of ego over evidence. But the most damaging testimony came from Dr. Vincent Kessler, whose technical analysis provided a minute-by-minute timeline of how the crisis had been mismanaged. Congressman, Dr. Castellanos identified molecular signatures at 0947 hours that indicated biological weapons contamination. When I attempted to report these findings to Colonel Thornfield, I was told to ignore them and focus on industrial solvent protocols. At 12:03 hours, she correctly predicted wind patterns that would carry contamination toward civilian areas. Colonel Thornfield dismissed these predictions and threatened disciplinary action against anyone who suggested evacuation procedures. Dr. Kessler, in your expert opinion, would civilian casualties have been completely prevented if Dr. Castellanos's warnings had been heeded? Absolutely. She identified the threat, predicted the exposure patterns, and recommended protective measures that would have prevented any civilian exposure. Every recommendation she made was scientifically sound and ultimately proven correct. The technical testimony was damning, but it was the emotional testimony from affected families that provided the most powerful indictment of Thornfield's leadership. Maria Santos, whose 8-year-old daughter had spent 2 days in critical condition, delivered testimony that brought the hearing room to stunned silence. My daughter asked me why the doctors didn't know how to help her at first. How do I explain to an 8-year-old that she was poisoned by her own government's weapons because someone was too proud to listen to advice? How do I tell her that she almost died not because of an accident, but because of ego? The human cost of institutional arrogance couldn't be quantified in budget reports or efficiency metrics. It was measured in children fighting for their lives, families traumatized by preventable exposure, and a community that would require decades of medical monitoring because their safety had been sacrificed to protect one person's authority. Congressman Rodriguez delivered the committee's preliminary findings with the gravity appropriate to such systematic failure. Colonel Thornfield, this committee finds that your actions directly contributed to civilian casualties that could have been completely prevented. Your refusal to acknowledge expertise, your threats against subordinates who tried to protect public safety, and your systematic obstruction of proper response protocols represent a failure of leadership that endangered American lives. Furthermore, he continued, this committee recommends criminal prosecution for criminal negligence, federal oversight of all biological weapons storage facilities, and mandatory integration of civilian expertise into military emergency response protocols. But perhaps the most significant outcome wasn't legal or administrative, it was cultural. The Granite Ridge incident had become a case study in how institutional authority, without corresponding expertise, could create disasters that proper leadership could have prevented. As Thornfield was led away to begin a federal prison sentence that would last considerably longer than her military career, the families in the gallery began the long process of rebuilding trust in institutions that had failed them so catastrophically. The reckoning was complete, but the real work of preventing similar disasters was just beginning. Dr. Mira Castellanos had proven that expertise could triumph over authority, but ensuring that lesson was institutionalized would require the kind of systematic change that challenged the very foundations of how military and civilian authority interacted during crisis situations. The question now was whether American institutions could learn from their failures quickly enough to prevent the next preventable disaster. 18 months after the Granite Ridge incident, Dr. Mira Castellanos stood in the newly constructed Crisis Response Center at the Department of Defense, watching as military and civilian personnel worked side by side in a facility that would have been impossible to imagine before the disaster that changed everything. The sterile walls were covered with real-time monitoring displays, classified threat assessments, and most importantly, direct communication links to civilian experts whose expertise could prevent the next catastrophe. Dr. Castellanos announced. Director James Morrison, his tone carrying the respect of someone who'd learned the hard way that expertise mattered more than institutional hierarchy. The Secretary of Defense is ready for your briefing on the new protocols. The transformation in Morrison had been as dramatic as the institutional changes he now oversaw. The man who'd once ordered Mira to maintain secrecy at the cost of civilian lives had become the leading advocate for transparency in crisis response. Sometimes catastrophic failure was the only teacher that could penetrate institutional arrogance. The briefing room was packed with officials who represented a new approach to emergency management, military commanders working alongside civilian scientists, federal agents collaborating with independent researchers, and most importantly, a chain of command that prioritized expertise over ego when lives were at stake. Secretary of Defense Patricia Williams opened the session with an acknowledgement that would have been unthinkable before Granite Ridge. Ladies and gentlemen, we're here because the old way of doing things nearly resulted in mass civilian casualties. Dr. Castellanos, please brief us on the new integrated response protocols. Mira activated the presentation display, showing a network of connections that linked military installations with civilian experts, medical facilities with classified research programs, and local emergency responders with federal oversight capabilities. The system was designed to ensure that expertise would be heard and heeded, regardless of its source or classification level. Mr. Secretary, the Granite Ridge reforms have created 3 fundamental changes in how we respond to biological and chemical threats. First, mandatory consultation with civilian experts during any suspected weapons-grade incident. Second, real-time information sharing between military medical personnel and specialized treatment facilities. Third, automatic declassification protocols that prioritize public safety over classification protection. The third point was revolutionary in the context of national security operations. For the first time in American history, protecting civilian lives had been given explicit priority over protecting classified information, with built-in mechanisms to ensure that life-saving knowledge could be shared when necessary. General Patricia Hawkins, who'd been promoted to oversee the new Integrated Response Division, provided operational details that demonstrated how dramatically military culture had changed. Dr. Castellanos, can you explain how these protocols worked during the recent incident at Fort Richardson? Certainly, General. When chemical sensors detected unknown substances at Fort Richardson, military personnel immediately contacted our civilian expert network rather than attempting to handle the situation internally. Dr. Sarah Kim at UC Berkeley identified the substance as a research chemical that had been mislabeled during transfer. Because of the new protocols, we were able to implement proper containment within 40 minutes instead of the hours or days it might have taken under the old system. The Fort Richardson incident had been a perfect test case for the new procedures. Potentially dangerous situation that was resolved quickly and safely because military personnel were required to seek outside expertise rather than punished for admitting they needed help. Agent Patricia Cross, now Director of the Biological Threats Assessment Division, described the cultural transformation that had followed the Granite Ridge investigations. The most significant change isn't in our procedures, it's in our mindset. Personnel are now rewarded for seeking expertise, promoted for acknowledging uncertainty, and protected for challenging authority when public safety is at stake. The mindset shift represented a fundamental change in military culture. The authoritarian structure that had once punished questions and rewarded blind obedience had been replaced by a collaborative approach that recognized expertise regardless of rank or institutional affiliation. Dr. Sophia Nakamura, now serving as Chief Medical Advisor for Biological Incidents, provided the medical perspective on institutional reform. The new protocols have eliminated the information barriers that prevented proper treatment at Granite Ridge. Medical personnel now have direct access to classified treatment databases and can consult with specialized facilities without bureaucratic delays. Dr. Nakamura asked the Secretary, what's been the impact on actual medical outcomes? Mr. Secretary, we've treated 17 biological or chemical exposure cases under the new protocols. 0 fatalities, minimal long-term health effects, and average treatment times reduced by 73% compared to historical cases. The numbers told the story of institutional learning translated into saved lives. The procedures that had been developed in response to Granite Ridge weren't just preventing disasters, they were improving outcomes when incidents did occur. Sergeant Tyler Brennan, now a commissioned officer in the new Crisis Response Division, represented the enlisted perspective on cultural change. Sir, the biggest difference is that personnel are encouraged to speak up when they see problems. Under the old system, questioning authority was career suicide. Under the new system, failing to question bad decisions is career suicide. The reversal was complete and intentional. The military culture that had once punished Brennan for seeking outside Help now promoted him for demonstrating the initiative and moral courage that had saved civilian lives. "Sergeant, excuse me, Lieutenant Brennan," Mira corrected with a smile. "Can you give us an example of how this cultural change works in practice?" "Yes, ma'am. Last month, a junior enlisted soldier at Fort Carson noticed discrepancies in chemical storage labels. Under the old system, he might have been told to mind his own business. Under the new system, his concerns triggered an immediate investigation that discovered improper storage of research materials. Because he was encouraged to speak up, we prevented another potential Granite Ridge." The Fort Carson example illustrated how institutional learning had created positive feedback loops. Personnel were incentivized to identify problems early, which prevented small issues from becoming major disasters. Director Morrison provided the administrative perspective on systemic reform. Dr. Castellanos, the Granite Ridge protocols have been adopted by 17 federal agencies and 34 state emergency management systems. We're seeing similar cultural changes throughout the emergency response community. The spread of the reforms beyond military installations demonstrated that the lessons of Granite Ridge were being applied wherever institutional authority might. Conflict with public safety. Fire departments, police agencies, and medical facilities were all implementing variations of the protocols that prioritized expertise over hierarchy during crisis situations. But perhaps the most significant change was represented by the families who'd been affected by the original incident. Maria Santos, whose daughter had been critically injured at Granite Ridge, now served on the Civilian Oversight Board that monitored biological weapon storage and emergency response procedures. Dr. Castellanos, Ms. Santos said during the public comment period, "My daughter is now 10 years old and healthy, thanks to the treatment protocols you provided. But more importantly, she's growing up in a world where institutions are required to listen to experts and protect public safety. That's the real victory from Granite Ridge." The transformation was complete, but not finished. Mira looked around. The briefing room had military officers working alongside civilian scientists, federal agents collaborating with independent researchers, and oversight boards that included affected families. The disaster at Granite Ridge had catalyzed changes that extended far beyond preventing biological weapons incidents. "Mr. Secretary," Mira concluded her presentation, "the Granite Ridge reforms have proven that expertise can be successfully integrated with authority, that transparency can coexist with security, and that institutions can learn from their failures if they're willing to prioritize public welfare over protecting ego." As the briefing concluded, Mira reflected on the journey from that morning 18 months ago when she'd been dismissed as an unqualified consultant. The scanner revelation that had exposed her classified background had been humiliating and terrifying, but it had also created the opportunity to force institutional change that would protect countless lives in the future. The children who'd been poisoned at Granite Ridge would carry the medical consequences of that exposure for the rest of their lives. But they would also live in a world where the institutional failures that had endangered them were far less likely to be repeated. Dr. Mira Castellanos had learned that sometimes the most powerful response to dismissal wasn't anger or resentment, it was simply being undeniably right when it mattered most. And when institutions were forced to choose between protecting their authority and protecting lives, expertise would always find a way to triumph. The new order wasn't perfect, but it was better. And in a world where biological weapons and institutional arrogance would always pose threats to civilian safety, better was often the difference between catastrophe and survival. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.